but no one's actually acknowledged what you did do. And you're like, sorry, did you, like, am I invisible? Like, what's happening? What is this reality? Like, I kept Missy so and so alive, and then this other person alive, and yet here you are criticizing me.
Hello, my beautiful friends. My name is Dr. Beck.
And I am Christine Barker, and this is Am I Doing It Wrong? A podcast for doctors by doctors. Dr. Beck is a mindset coach and medical doctor who specialises in liberating driven professional women from the limitations of perfectionism, imposter syndrome, and people pleasing. She's basically the cheat code for getting out of your own way, showing up authentically, and living a life you're proud of.
And Christine is a medical educator and nephrologist who creates resources for doctors in training that I truly think are an unfair advantage. She makes complex topics super simple and takes the pain and uncertainty out of passing your medical exams. Christine and I connected a few years ago via our online platforms, and over the years we've discussed countless highs, lows, and in-betweens of doctor life. And in doing so, we've experienced firsthand the power of vulnerable conversations to show us where we're getting in our own way and underestimating our capacity.
So we want you to be part of the conversation and experience these same results. Every week on the pod, we'll be bringing you conversations which shine light in dark places, normalise the doctor journey, ease unnecessary suffering, and give you actionable steps to thrive in all facets of your life. So grab a cuppa and get cozy for this week's episode of Am I Doing It Wrong? The podcast for doctors by doctors.
Hello, my beautiful friends, and welcome back to our channel and the third episode of our new podcast, Am I Doing It Wrong? It's so good to be here with you guys again. We are just loving this whole process of being able to authentically chat online instead of, in any kind of really structured or formed strategic way. Just we have to talk about life and the challenges, the ups and downs. So this process has been really natural and enjoyable for us. We hope that you're really enjoying it too. Today we thought a really fun and hot topic to talk about would be feedback. And Christy and I were just talking about how feedback comes up in our life and also for our people that we help. And I just wanted to hand it over to you, Christine, to talk about receiving feedback in the hospital, because once again I think we receive feedback in a very specific way in the hospital based on our culture, so you're a bit more connected with that at the moment peri-exams.
Yep, absolutely. And it's a juicy one today. So I think with feedback there's probably quite a bit to unpack, in that my perception of feedback is that most feedback that you're gonna receive is usually with a negative slant, right? So there's probably a lot of positive feedback that could be given, but when we're in a situation of receiving feedback, often it's something we can improve on or something that has a fairly negative perception, at least by us, right? So I think that imbalance between negative and positive feedback is sort of important to acknowledge in medical culture. But also feedback is delicate, and I think that whenever you're receiving feedback, it's important to tune into, did you ask for the feedback? Who's given you the feedback? Do you actually value their opinion? Do you think that they have your best interests at heart, for example? And do you really believe the feedback and want to take it on board? Because I think we are aware of our strengths and our weaknesses, and we can own them. But I think as part of the feedback process, it is important to tune into those things and really pick and choose, what do you want to hold on to from that, and what do you want to let sort of wash over you, I think is how that's my feeling on feedback in medical culture. What about yourself, Beck? What do you think about that?
Oh, all of it resonates, and it just makes me think about how multi-layered something as simple as we put down to receiving feedback is. There's so many different elements to consider, and in any one feedback interaction, some of these elements are much more important than others. For example, as you've said, who's giving the feedback, what's the perspective that they're coming from, and talking about what was their intention, what was the purpose, what are they trying to do delivering this feedback, and also considering the context, as you said, of, in medicine, receiving feedback often only because you're doing something wrong, usually, It's feedback to try and get you to do something differently, which really skews our perspective and makes us more afraid of feedback than we need to be, because any feedback usually means we're doing something wrong in our minds, at least. Oh, there's so much, and this is always it ends up being a really liberating coaching topic whenever we work on it. And I always have to follow the client in terms of what actually caught their attention in the specific feedback scenario, what the problem is, or where they're getting stuck with the feedback. Because at any one of those points, even without listing all the different points, we can stumble and miss out when it comes to feedback, and even really hurt ourselves a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can think of an example during my training. It's a little bit of a delicate scenario, but my goal in sharing this story would not be to sort of put anyone else down, but I think it is a powerful story that a lot of us could recognize. So, when thinking about what we're going to talk about today, I had this memory of when I was doing my advanced training, and I got this negative feedback from, I was like a first year trainee, and I got feedback from my third year, like sort of senior advanced trainee. And the feedback that they had to give me, when I was receiving the feedback, I remember taking it as truth and being like, oh, I think that's hard to take. And then when I was in the car on the way home, I started to be like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense to me. And then I started to get angry about it. And it was really interesting because the feedback was about, there was a situation where the system around me had led me to a place where I was in literal tears on the ward. Just tears came and I just had to go and hide in the cupboard. And her feedback, yeah, totally, right? Totally. And anyway, so her feedback to me was, I heard this happened, and that's not what you're supposed to do. You're a trainee now, you're going to be a consultant, and your job is to remain, sort of strong in every situation and show no emotion and lead the team, right? So that was the feedback she was trying to give me. But in truth, what had happened is that she was actually away overseas in recent days and had come back and gave me this feedback. My other colleague was off on sick leave, and we had covers. And so I was we were understaffed, under-resourced. I was trying my best. And on top of that, I had done this procedure, like a renal biopsy, on the weekend by myself, unsupported, and they had a complication and they bled. And there was all these things. It was a horrible thing. Plus I was sleep deprived from doing transplants. It was just one thing after another. I had the worst 5 days of my life. And then she delivered this to me on the fifth day. And I was like, gosh, I probably shouldn't have cried. But on the way home, I was like, wait a minute. Like, any normal human would have cried. Like, I hadn't slept. You know what I mean? It was horrible. So I think I just wanted to sort of share that story, in as much as now looking back, I can see exactly what she meant, and she was well-intentioned, and she was trying to tell me how to be a leader. And so her perspective was so valid, but in the moment, it wasn't what I needed. I needed a cuddle. I needed someone to understand where I was at and see my potential and help me through it. And yeah, so I think sometimes feedback can be very well-intentioned, but it's not necessarily the right way to deliver the feedback, maybe. And I think we could all get a little bit better at sort of understanding the other person's, how they think things are going, and maybe be a bit more curious before you give the feedback, because you don't know what's going on behind the scenes. Yeah.
So much in that. I definitely hold the perspective that feedback is a gift. In any case, it's a gift, and we have this opportunity to maximize any wisdom that comes from that. And you might find, when you review the feedback, when you're in a good place, that there is wisdom in that for you, or you might actually find that there's nothing in that for you. Their perspective, their values, and your values don't actually align. But in any case, we are all human, and you cannot ask yourself to receive difficult feedback, things that are difficult to separate from your self-concept and your predictions of the future. That's what your mind does. When you receive information, it instantly says, it doesn't just take raw data, it says, what does this mean for me and about me right now? And what does this mean for me and about me in the future? And when you're receiving negative feedback, it's so easy for that to be a threat for you right now. And if not that, a potential threat for you in the future. And therefore, for it to be so difficult to take that negative feedback. So the other side of this coin is, and something that I think is a duty of people in leadership and people in these authority or expert positions, is to also take responsibility for delivering feedback in a constructive way. There's responsibility on both parts, for the person receiving the feedback to do the best they can, and for the person delivering the feedback, if you're in a leadership position, to deliver it well in a way that actually, if the point is to help this person grow, then don't just dump you know, your thoughts and what you want to see change on them in any circumstance. You know, it's like, if we put this often in a physical context, it helps people understand. It's like saying, I don't know, the person with the broken leg, just walk, you know, I know your leg's broken, but just walk in it. You can, you know, limp a little bit, walk. You can take this, just make the most out of this. There's, I don't know, there's something good at the end of the street that you want to get. If you want it, it's there for you. Go and get it. So just walk. And you're walking on this broken leg. It's not as simple as it's the responsibility of the recipient to take the feedback in any context. So that is, that's what that brings up for me, you know, and I think doctors end up in these physiologically challenging scenarios where our stress response has been stretched and extended beyond the point where you have that excellent executive function or emotional regulation. And then we ask more of ourselves in those situations, and it's just not human. So that's what I think. I think in my concept of the hospital system, receiving feedback is something that giving feedback is something that we ought to be trained in if we're in any leadership position. And lots of us end up in leadership. Well, all of us end up in leadership positions, not by choice, but because it is a part of your job as a doctor.
I think that giving feedback is uncomfortable. I mean, I'm in a position now where, to be honest, I'm blessed with really talented younger, trainees around me. To be honest, I very rarely come across a situation where I have to give very negative feedback, but I've definitely been in those situations in the last few years, and it's uncomfortable if like an underperforming trainee or something like that. And I don't think I was ever really trained to do it. It's just an exercise I feel in using my emotional intelligence and trying to mold it to this person, but it's not comfortable at all. And I think you're right. I think we probably should be having those conversations about how you do that, how you actually deliver feedback.
Yeah, we are. We say that, a lot of the major hospitals are training hospitals, yet we don't learn how to train people, which inevitably involves feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, do you know what? I've also seen the other side where I'm probably speaking out of turn, but I have seen when you go to the college, like I'm trained to be a supervisor, and you go to these college training dinners, and you're with other consultants who are also doing the training, and they'll show you a video of a trainee, and they'll be like, how do you think the trainee performed? And I'm always like, glass half full. They're only a trainee. They didn't kill anyone. Probably on the more positive end of the spectrum. Whereas I'll look around my table and people are just like, fail, 2 out of 10. And you're like, really? Like, I don't know. So I think sometimes it's actually not fair. The system's not really built to support you gaining your own potential. Like, it's not built to see the good in you either, in a way. And it was interesting to me to see that, because I don't know what other people are doing when they're giving negative feedback, but it feels like some senior medical staff are very ready to give negative feedback. It's very foreign to me. It's funny.
It's in those situations, I think the responsible thing is, if we're making these kinds of calls that affects people's lives, to really ask people to explain themselves. And I think this is the tricky thing about the hierarchy that inevitably exists in bigger organizations, which is that authority stops being questioned, and authority exists just because of positions, not because of expert leadership or management skills or it's very interesting how the hospital, how we train doctors in that we get excellent clinicians. We filter in excellent clinicians because all the training systems we put people through. So we know they're good clinicians, and then we ask them to be these leaders as well, including giving feedback. And they're not necessarily very good at assessing other people in the first place and then delivering feedback. So even the feedback that they offer, just because they're in an authority position, it doesn't actually mean the feedback hosts any really useful information for the trainee. As you've sort of, you brought up with your experience, this person who was the authority in your case, your senior, gave you the feedback to remain strong, and to them being strong meant to not show any emotion.
Yeah.
Yeah. The validity of that feedback, or whatever value is in that feedback for you, it's not necessarily useful feedback just because this person was in an authority position or an expert position. It's so easy to see people who are in authority positions to you and hear what they say and believe that it must be true. And if it doesn't align with you, then you really need to work out how it aligns with you. There's something wrong with you if it doesn't align with you, and you have to contort yourself to make that feedback true and make it useful.
But to an extent, now looking back, that there was truth in it, right? I mean, by standards, the leader of the team is supposed to be the person who maintains composure and remains calm in every situation because you're leading the team. So I get it. Like, I get why that was the feedback I was delivered that day, but it just wasn't maybe just not the right time to give me that feedback. I was still in it. I was in it, and I was sleep deprived, and I was in it, and I was on the edge. And it was like, it wasn't the right time to receive it. And maybe if I was to give that feedback to someone, I probably, maybe because I had that experience of the way that had happened to me, it's made me better, that I'd probably, understand someone was emotional. So my first thing to do would be a check-in. What happened? And yeah, on one hand, that was your situation. On the other hand, it would be good to work towards, I guess it's hard to actually think of the solutions in that situation, to go back and do it differently. But I think I would have received that feedback more easily if there was a check-in first. If I just felt this person really cared about my well-being, I think the whole space would have been different. And it's not that they didn't care, but I'm sure they did care about my well-being. I'm sure they'd be horrified hearing this, but that's not my goal. My goal is to just, I guess, give a story about how we can well-meaningly give that feedback, and it's not landing well and not productive, I guess.
Yeah, things we want to take into consideration when giving feedback. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think the other thing is, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this, Beck, is that negative feedback seems to land so differently from positive feedback. Like, if someone gives me a compliment or says I'm doing a great job, I'm like, yeah, clearly, obviously, or whatever, that's fine, sure, because I have these standards for myself, or maybe I don't think I'm doing as well, and if someone sort of cheers me on, I'll mute it, I'll ignore it, I'll diminish it. Whereas negative feedback, it lands on me, I take it in, I sort of ruminate over it and obsess over it for a while. So I think that's another interesting thing. Although in hospital systems you're probably more likely to get negative feedback than positive feedback, do we really hear the positive feedback is another question. What would you say to that?
I would love to circle back to this, but just before we move on, I want to hear how because it sounds like you received this feedback in a really challenging situation, and the feedback was quite extreme, to remain strong, which means showing no emotion. And then you've come out of the other side and you've extracted some good out of it that actually aligns with you. So, and you said, I saw the truth in it. And this is just a really interesting thing because you also mentioned at the start, it's very easy to take the feedback as gospel truth. This is what you should do. This is how you should be. And showing no emotion isn't how you are as a doctor. And then you also talked about being emotional. So I'm just so interested because you have clearly heard the feedback, and this is what I say to do, put it through your filter of your values. You know, you take it under advisement and you line it up with what you know and what they know that you don't know, and then you decide what to do with it, instead of, as you say, take it as gospel. So you've heard the feedback and then you put it through your filter. What do you think about remaining strong, showing no emotion, and as a leader in the hospital?
That's such an interesting question. I think as a consultant, it is a million times easier to maintain composure because you're not in the system where you're having 2 hours sleep and in the hospital for a transplant every night. Like, it's just, without sleep deprivation, your brain is just happier. It's just a better place. And of course, as a consultant, you can get woken up by a phone call, but the registrars are filtering a lot of that stuff for you. You know, I might get a transplant call that wakes me up or whatever, but it's not that relentless. And also, as a consultant, I'm doing ward service for sort of 2 weeks at a time, not this continuous like 1 in 3 on call as a trainee. So I think that is probably the main difference in that the system changes when you become a consultant. I guess that's the first thing to say, because I don't want anyone to feel like they're the problem, because I mean, there were lots of learning points in that for me, but there was some of it that was just like, I wasn't eating, sleeping, hydrating well, and also all the other things. So I think that getting your good basics and your self-care and just getting the opportunity to do that is like, it will set you up for more emotional regulation and success, like you mentioned. But I do feel that there is a truth to that, in as much as at the bedside, when someone is sick and there's an emergency and you're the consultant and you're calm, the patient's calm, everyone's calm, it sets a tone. I do believe in setting a tone, and I think as a leader now, that would be important to me. Yeah, so I do believe it's true. I just think that if my trainee goes and cries in the cupboard, I don't necessarily think that, I don't know. I think my first thing would be to support and figure out what's going on, as opposed to provide any kind of feedback on that, you know, because it's just, I don't know, it seems like the system, I would love to change so many things about the system, but the system feels sometimes like it was built to break us, and things are getting better. But that's my own perspective, though. I'm sure people who aren't as maybe never had the emotional meltdown in the cupboard would say something different. I wonder.
Yeah. Oh, it sounds like the feedback you were given went, like, only little tiny bits of it you allowed through your filter, this show no emotion. And you heard the message, you heard the concern from this person senior to you, and then you really stayed strong in what you thought was right. And you're like, yes, as a part of the medical team, my emotional state, and therefore the way I show up from that, is really important. But also, I don't expect my my trainees who have not met their basic physiological needs to show no emotion. So I just wanted to highlight that, because you kind of swept over the fact that there was truth in what this person said, without really claiming how sophisticated it was for you to take the important bit, and leave the rest that you don't agree with, and stand firm in what you think is right for your team as a leader. That's the goal with feedback, isn't it? To take it under advisement, align it with your values, take the wisdom out of it.
But it's easier said than done. And I think the other thing is, when you've had an experience like that and you get negative feedback, I know what really helped at the time was going home and bouncing it off someone that I really trusted, whose feedback did mean something to me, and being like, this was said to me today. What do you think about this? Because to process that kind of thing on your own, it actually is a little bit traumatic. Like, you know, I think you can get a little bit lost in it and searching for your truth, especially as a trainee. I don't think you feel quite as confident in your own abilities, because you're on such a learning curve. Everything's already hard. And if someone delivers that to you, I think it would be worth, if it's bothering you, if it's emotionally upsetting you, some feedback, I think it would be worthwhile finding someone you trust, and, you know, but be prepared in that conversation to hear something you don't want to hear. But equally, I think it's important to process that feedback if it's upset you.
I think that is a difficult thing to ask of yourself, to have that highest level of executive functioning and reasoning when you're sleep deprived and you're not meeting those basic physiological needs. So I hear that you are seeking support, knowing that you weren't able to hold this extra difficult situation that was added on top. You weren't able to hold that sort of rationally in your mind at the time because of those basic things not being met. So I think seeking support in those moments and perspective taking, what you were doing there, getting perspectives from other people who you trusted, I think that's a really compassionate and reasonable step forwards in a situation where the feedback is hard to take.
And I think something else that just came up for me there when thinking about that was maybe the balance of acknowledgement versus feedback as well. Like when you are working so hard and trying your best, like you are putting in the hours, you're putting your heart and soul into your rotation or whatever you're doing. And I think so many of us can relate to that feeling. And then you get negative feedback, but no one's acknowledged. I guess it comes back to that positive stuff as well, the positive feedback, but no one's actually acknowledged what you did do. And you're like, sorry, did you, like, am I invisible? Like, what's happening? What is this reality? You know, like, I kept Missy so-and-so alive, and then this other person alive, and yet here you are criticizing me. It just feels very like, what is happening? Why am I in this conversation? Do you know what I mean? Yeah, so I think acknowledgement is also something that we crave. I think we crave, and I think it's important. And I think as managers and leaders, I think acknowledging your team is a superpower, especially if you do plan to have healthy negative feedback as part of your system that's going to help people grow and achieve their potential. I think you have to have a healthy dose of acknowledgement. Yeah.
Yeah, that was something I really craved when I first got into the hospital. Not even from a validating boost my self-esteem perspective, but from a, I'm not an expert here. I don't know what I don't know. Can someone please be like, yep, that was a good thing. Repeat that in the future, as opposed to, that was 50%, right? Maybe tweak this next time. And so therefore don't repeat it in the future. It's quite unsettling to not have any review of your work.
As high achievers, I feel like we're built on that system where, you know, we've had work hard, reward, and then suddenly you're a doctor and it's like, work hard, be ignored. I don't know. What is this? So I think the game changes when you're employed, doesn't it, compared to being at school, being at uni. All of a sudden you're just lost, absorbed into the system.
Yeah, we've all lived a life of constant validation all the way through. You had external recognition just by virtue of constantly having assessments and needing to be scored and marked on those assessments, right?
Yeah. And then it's hard to let go of that. You're like, how am I doing now? What's my rating now?
Exactly, what's my rating?
Out of 5, out of 10, tell me. But
it's not trivial, is it? Because this is probably the time, you know, all of what you did before you were a doctor was learning. And at the time where you're actually practicing, it makes sense to want to know that you're doing the best thing for your patients and not hurting anybody, and the best thing for your colleagues as well, that you're a team member who's contributing in a sufficient amount. It all makes sense to want that. I don't think there's anything wrong with us wanting that positive feedback, not because we want to feel better, but because we want to repeat things that are useful. We want to train the pathways that are useful for us, for our team, for our patients. It makes so much sense, and I don't think it's self-indulgent. I think it's related to impact and contribution for the most part.
I'm just trying to think about how, I guess, self-validation and self-reflection come into that, because on one hand, I believe it's not self-indulgent, but it can, if you sort of constantly do need that reassurance from somewhere else, and especially if you're sort of getting feedback from people who are very willing to give feedback without really holding space for the consequences or your potential. I guess it depends who's around you, but you can fall into a trap of needing that validation from elsewhere and not being able to see the good in yourself. And I think there is a little bit of, I mean, it's interesting though, when you're a doctor in training, how do you do that? how do you know if what you're doing is enough? What would you say to that?
The first thing I had to do was not associate a lack of good feedback with me doing something wrong. I had to actively do that. I think my brain was just trained to associate doing good things with good feedback. And then when I wasn't getting good feedback, not because I was getting bad feedback, but just because I wasn't getting any recognition, as you say, it was easy for me on a daily basis to think, I'm probably not doing this right, just because of that simple association I had. And so I had to catch that constantly. Doubting, allowing the doubt to be there when there wasn't any recognition of success, I suppose.
And I'm interested though, because it sounds like maybe that's like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong though, but a lot of our recognition that we're seeking is from above, like our consultants and our seniors. But I think so much of the recognition that's more easily achievable in the day to day is from patients and nurses and the allied health team. And so I guess a perspective shift might help you get more on track. Like if you feel that you're contributing meaningfully to other people's workday, and your colleagues seem to get on well with you. I mean, I think that is succeeding in the workplace. And patients' feedback is like, could there be anything better than a happy patient? Yeah. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and that probably brings me back to that point that you brought up about how we kind of disregard positive feedback. It's easy to sort of ignore the positive feedback that comes and fixate on negative feedback. And, I think it also comes down to where you want to improve and where you feel insecure as to where you actually crave feedback. Because I think about how, when I'm in the hospital, I don't have any insecurity or doubt that I am a good doctor to patients, in that I seek to understand them. I am patient-centered. I am compassionate. I give the time that they need within reason. That's not something so when a patient gives me feedback, yes, it's lovely, but it's not feeling a deficit when a patient gives me positive feedback, it's not feeling a deficit that I needed to be filled. Probably because maybe I get enough feedback from patients in that area and I am secure in myself about that. Whereas I think when I think about wanting feedback, I do want it from the people senior to me in medicine, because I'm like, you are the experts in the clinical aspect here. I want to improve in my clinical abilities, and therefore I need feedback from somebody who is more expert at that than me, and I naturally give that to the people who are senior clinicians. But as you were referring to before, it does cause a problem if you want or need that feedback. You make it so you need that feedback and it's not available. So it quickly became something that I stopped seeking and started to self-validate to the extent that I could and that I wanted to, which is limited, because textbooks can't give you that information when you're talking about like the art of clinical medicine, can it? Recognizing that if you are depending on feedback in a situation where you found that feedback isn't available, where you've attempted to a reasonable extent, an extent that you're happy with, and found that it's not available, then you need to make the decision to stop needing that feedback, figure out why you need it, that positive feedback or positive reinforcement, and then, as you say, learn to self-validate. And that might be pulling up the errors in your thinking that are causing you distress, not having the feedback. And it might be, of course, a reasonable change in circumstance in being able to do whatever you can do without a more experienced expert's input to work out when you're doing the right thing or not.
So how would you, because obviously you must do this in your coaching as well, but if someone is just like realizing that they have that issue where they are seeking validation and it's not always available and they're learning to validate themselves, how would you suggest that they start?
What I often find in the work that I do, your values usually get revealed and become obvious, what matters to you, what's important to you, after you remove the errors in your thinking that are existing that aren't aligned with your values. So there might be thoughts that are driving you to want validation, or want that validation from other people. Let's just use this example of not knowing if your clinical medicine is at the gold standard, the standard that you want it to be, and seeking feedback from somebody senior or specialist in that area to tell you whether or not your work is on track. I guess one of the first errors would be, a very simple thought error would be that the absence of feedback suggests that you're doing it wrong. Because, as I said, that was probably one of the thought errors that was in my mind as I started medicine, which is when I say it, it might sound really obvious that an absence of positive feedback, an absence of a tick beside the box, doesn't mean the opposite, that you're doing it wrong. But when that's always been the way that your mind ticks things off and says, yep, I've nailed that subject, I've nailed that topic, I'm good. If that tick box is left open, you can walk around thinking, I don't know how to do this. I'm not sure that I know how to do this. I'm not sure that this topic is complete. I can't move on because I haven't definitely worked this out yet. There are topics in my mind that have stayed open, hyponatremia, for example, where I've never gotten validation that I've managed this correctly. And then every time I spend extra time doubting myself while I'm doing it, I have no idea whether I've done it right or wrong. Yes, the patient's safe in every single case and they improve inevitably. You can watch the numbers improve, or they plateau at a place that the expert ends up deciding is their new baseline and can't be changed. So there's always, nothing's ever gone wrong. But for me, I still don't know hyponatremia because I haven't gone through each scenario and been like, yes, I know exactly my clinical assessment has been validated by an expert in that area, But so for self-validation in that case, I need to decide that this is good enough, that what I'm doing is good enough. I could choose to push further to understand that, to find new resources in the medical literature. I've downloaded many papers about hyponatremia. But the other element it is to what is enough for me? To what extent, when am I going to stop reading papers on this? And making validation at that point that's not perfect. That's not like I've got this, but at the point of this is enough. I'm deciding for me this is enough.
It's such a great example, the hyponatremia. I have so many things to say about this. But what I find is that, if you're struggling with something like that, like an actual medical condition, chances are everyone's struggling with it. And that's why you'll never get the feedback, because your consultant's coming along being like, oh, not today. I don't want to do this today. Honestly. And I feel like, because I have obviously a medical education platform, and everything that anyone ever wants me to teach is always the thing I don't want to teach. Renal tubular acidosis, I'm now able to teach that. Do you know how many hours it took me to be able to teach that? I can't even, because I had no base, I had no foundation, because I don't think anyone, not anyone knows how to, I'm sure there are great people out there. I did not encounter anyone who could simplify that enough for me in the way I think. So I had to spend hours to be able to teach it. And I'm really glad I did that. But sodium's actually one of those things. Sodium is coming. I need to do sodium because it's it's a journey is sodium. So no, you're not alone, Beck, and there's nothing wrong with you.
Yeah. And the thing that goes wrong, isn't it, is when I make it a problem and then I waste my resources trying to validate myself or get validation from somewhere it's not available, and just making that decision about when it's enough and validating yourself from that's enough is really important.
Yeah, no, it really is. And I really love that that tool that you've given us to sort of just observe your thoughts and see where it's coming up. Like, I really liked what you said about you were making it a problem, not getting feedback must mean X, when it doesn't really mean anything at all. It probably means you're doing just fine. And so I think just really like getting that thought in your mind, and then whenever you have that come up, just refer back to it, just revisit it again and again until you really believe it. I think that's gold.
As I was saying it, I realized how simple that thought is, and I have to show my clients this over and over again. There's not some deep, elaborate belief system here that explains why you need validation in a lot of cases. That's a very simple thought error hidden in plain sight that I needed to sit back and observe happening. This false association of nobody's validated what I'm doing. It could be wrong. It might be wrong. It is wrong. Simple things like that. And if you don't sit back and usually it just comes as a feeling of like, look, I have so much to do. I've got so much more to learn, in a bad way, you know. It's a feeling, and if you don't go up and look at the thought that's causing it, you don't get an opportunity to be like, oh, that reasoning is invalid, so I can stop feeling this way. I can just make a decision about what's enough.
I'm really keen to hear what our listeners think about this as well. I guess if you guys have any thoughts, anything you want to share, obviously pop it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your experience with feedback, good and bad, and if this resonates with you, if you think that maybe you could change your perspective on this to sort of change your game.
Yeah, because we've talked about a few different areas in feedback today. We've talked about considering how the feedback is delivered and the state that you're in when you receive the feedback and how that affects your ability to take it on. We've considered the person, the source of the feedback, and with both of those two things, we thought about how you take the wisdom out of that feedback in the moment, aligning it with your values, putting it through your filter, because in your example, which was fantastic, the actual verbatim feedback you got was very different to what you actually took on and enacted that was totally in your values. And then we've gone on to talk about the challenges of being in, going from being a high achiever and going through, education systems that constantly give you validation, and then the natural thought errors that can come about when you stop getting that external validation, and really the need to stop and look at them. If you notice that your behavior is, this might show up as overworking. It might show up as hiding from certain topics or certain situations because you're telling yourself, I don't know how to do that yet. I'm not good enough at that yet. It all might come from these thought errors of a lack of validation or a lack of positive feedback, meaning that you don't know what you're doing, you're not good enough in this area, and therefore you should hide or work more.
I think that's a really great sum up. I can't believe you remembered all that, babe. That was amazing.
You know what I really wanted to talk about, because this is something that I think hits a lot of us with feedback, is feeling attacked and feeling defensive. Maybe we can talk about that one another time, because the defensive state, that's definitely something that comes up for me, feeling defensive when receiving feedback, and it just shuts it all down. It makes it so hard for me to do what you did, which is take all the wisdom in it. And I had to work really hard to not feel attacked and defensive getting feedback. And even when I started as a doctor, that was a problem that I had. I felt defensive when I was getting feedback. And it's something that I have been able to finally overcome. Not that I never feel defensive anymore, but it's so hard to live a life where feedback feels like an attack. It's a really hard way to live your life, and you do miss out on being able to do these amazing things like what you've done, which is take that little bit of wisdom.
I think there's so much to unpack in that defensiveness, because the reason for the defensiveness is, I think we definitely should talk about that in another episode. I'd love to hear your take on that.
Well, thank you guys so much. Again, so fun to talk about this stuff, and it definitely makes me a little bit as you said, I really empathize with the challenges in these scenarios when you're in a professional setting and you're trying to do a good job. You're trying to do the right thing by everyone on your team, and then having to process difficult conversations often when you're not in a filled up physiological space, sleep deprived, haven't eaten your lunch, haven't gone to the bathroom for 8 hours, whatever the standard is in the hospital. So yeah, we can't wait to hear. Let us know any aspects of receiving feedback that you guys find difficult too, because as we kind of said at the start, there is so much here. We could probably do a whole podcast season on receiving feedback.
Absolutely. And actually, just when I think about it, we love feedback on this podcast because we're trying something new. We're developing in this space. We're learning a lot about this whole process and how to speak live and all of the things. So if you have any feedback for us or anything that you want to hear on the podcast, we'd also be very open to that, very open to the feedback.
So much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Leave your feedback down below. We cannot wait to hear from you guys, and we will see you next week. Bye, everyone.
I've been waiting all my life for something. I've been down the darkest roads and up